Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now from Washington by the founder of Freedom Now and a lawyer for Liu Xia, Jared Genser. And in Beijing, we have Qinduo, former chief correspondent for China Radio International. Thanks both so much for joining us. Xu, let me start with you in Beijing. Qinduo, why is Liu Xia still under house arrest without charge and barred even from visits from diplomats now?
Well, I'm not sure about the details and exactly what happened to her, but I'm pretty sure she's grieving because she lost her husband last year because of cancer of liver. So no, the details actually is not completely out about what's happening to her, or whether she stays in Beijing or somewhere else, or is she planning to leave the country or any other plans. No, I'm not exactly sure about that. But we know she's a widow of, yeah.
Yes, we do know that, but we also know she's been under effective house arrest now for 8 years in China. Why?
How sure are people in terms of she's being house arrest or detained by the Chinese government? She is an artist. She has her own work. She has been working for the past years, but she's just one of the common folks in China. Few people know exactly. There are 1.4 billion people in China. It's hard to know any individual what's happening to her or him. As long as you are following the law, I don't think anything will happen to you. If you're breaking the law, you'll be punished. That's the case. That's the case in China. That's the case in any other countries, I guess.
Okay, Jared, let me ask you, is it that simple? Is she perhaps breaking the law and she's being punished for it as per Chinese law?
Well, the Chinese government has never said that she's been charged with any crime, never indicted her, never presented her before any court. I got to know Liu Xia a number of months before her husband won the Nobel Peace Prize, was announced as the recipient of the 2010 prize, and was talking regularly to her about preparing her husband's case before the United Nations. Very shortly after it was announced that her husband was going to be the recipient of the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize, a security cordon came around her, and it was impossible for me to then be in touch with her on a going forward basis. She made very, very clear to me before she was ultimately placed under house arrest that she would want to remain in regular touch with me, and that if anything impeded that, it was not going to be of her choice, but it was going to be because she was being prevented from being able to be in touch with me as her international lawyer. And over the last 8 years, numerous diplomats have tried to visit, just like they have recently, and have been turned away. We won her case and that of her husband, Liu Xiaobo, before the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which said that they're being held arbitrarily and in violation of international law. And as her husband was quite sick last summer, both she and Liu Xiaobo expressed their intentions to be able to travel abroad for Liu Xiaobo to have medical treatment. And she's been quoted recently on a handful of occasions where word has gotten out from where she is, that she's incredibly depressed, that she desperately wants to leave China. She was, of course, just recently almost visited by 5 European diplomats who were turned away at the front entrance to her apartment building. So I think it's very, very clear she's under house arrest. It's arbitrary and in violation of international law. Under international law, China has a duty to allow all of its citizens to travel freely within China and to be able to travel abroad under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Okay, Qinduo, I saw you had a response there. Do go ahead.
Yes, from what Jared talked about, obviously, and also, of course, you can, if you access the news, the coverage about Liu Xia and Liu Xiaobo, we know what happened to Liu Xiaobo. As the wife of Liu Xiaobo, we don't know exactly what happened right now, but we know about more than 10 years ago, in 2010, Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2008, 2009, he was imprisoned, but then the prize was awarded to him. That was considered as a serious offense to the Chinese government, to the sovereignty and the respect of law in China. But the thing is, if you look at China now, it's an open country. You see travelers. China actually boasts the largest number of travelers, international travelers, every year. So people do have the freedom. If you leave the country, if you visit any country, that's no problem. And another point I want to add is there's a lot of involvement.
I'm sorry, just to be clear here, we're not talking about the average Chinese person. We're talking about people who speak out against the government because they believe the government is in violation of basic human rights. I have to ask you this. As you've said, China has become a very powerful country, and with that comes more and more exposure. You have these travelers, as you said, for example, coming through. So with that exposure, you would think China wouldn't want the kind of negative publicity it is getting from cases like this. Now, you can say you're not really sure what's going on, what the government is doing, why she's still under house arrest or not, but does it matter to you as a Chinese citizen that your country is getting this kind of negative publicity at the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, for example, because of what your government does to dissidents?
Well, interesting. You see him, Liu Xiaobo, Mr. Liu, as a dissident. He's a very controversial figure. He talked about in Hong Kong. The reason why Hong Kong is successful because Hong Kong was colonized for 100 years. If you want a real change in China, which is much larger than Hong Kong, you need to make China colonized for 300 years. Do you think Chinese people are happy to hear that? Remember, China has a history of 100 years of humiliation and colonization by Western powers. Do you think we are happy to accept that? And also remember, the prize was given to him after he was imprisoned. In any country, that's a serious offense. That's a disrespect of our sovereignty. I think I understand why the government is not happy with that. And so, that's a criminal. If a criminal, you can argue, you can have a lawyer, whether he's guilty or not. That's no problem. That's a legal issue. But awarding the prize to him, the Nobel Peace Prize has become a political tool against China. So this is a so-called negative coverage internationally. If that's the case, then leave it as you like.
Okay, Jared, go ahead.
Sure. Well, look, I'm really pleased to be able to have this debate with Mr. Xu in Beijing. It's good to be able to have these kinds of direct discussions. But let's just be clear. There are two entirely different issues that we're talking about. The first is the issue that relates to Liu Xiaobo and his being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And while undoubtedly there's some of his views that he expressed over the years that were more controversial to the Chinese government than others, at the end of the day, the views that he was expressing were fully consistent with the international right to freedom of opinion and expression. And in fact, he was imprisoned for the subversion of state power, which is an overbroad national security offense. But whether or not he was a criminal, and I firmly believe he was not, because he was acting within his rights under international law to express his views peacefully and nonviolently, what has happened to his now widow is totally different and totally unrelated to alleged crimes he may or may not have committed. Let's be clear, Liu Xia, according to the Chinese government, has never been charged with any crime. And yet she's been detained for 8 years or so without charge or trial. And so this is the issue that I'm focused on today as Liu Xiaobo and Liu Xia's lawyer. I was initially hired to represent Liu Xiaobo and began representing his wife Liu Xia a number of months before he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And it is inexplicable and contrary to the rule of law and a flagrant violation of China's obligations under both its own and international law that she be held without charge or trial for such a lengthy and extended period of time. And so I would, of course, agree with Mr. Xu that China has accomplished many things for its own people. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's a great nation with a storied tradition and history. And I don't dispute any of those general claims. But as a human rights lawyer, my focus is on representing individual people suffering under oppression from governments that aren't following their own and international legal obligations. And what is happening to Liu Xia herself is exactly that, a flagrant violation of her rights under Chinese and international law.
Okay, Qinduo, let me ask you this then. Is it worth the damage to China's reputation as a great country to continue to punish the relatives of human rights activists in particular?
Liu Xia was not known for being a human rights activist, as Jared has pointed out, I guess. Yeah, she's a family of Liu Xiaobo. What happened to Liu Xiaobo, has happened. But to Liu Xia, she's let's see, view her as ordinary folks, right? whatever happened between her and the Chinese government, I don't think the Chinese government sees Liu Xia as a threat. She's just an individual, and she can stay in China, she can stay in another country. China is a powerful country. China doesn't need to be, to fear any individual person, Chinese citizen or citizen from other countries. But look, in this case, you have the participation, active participation by foreign diplomats, by foreign governments, foreign lawyers here. I think that's very sensitive to Chinese people and to Chinese government. They don't like to see somehow they are under pressure by the foreigners, and then they have do like as ordered by the foreigners do. No, that's sometimes works the opposite effect.
Okay, Jared, I'd like to get your response to that. I mean, does the pressure from the international community actually backfire in this case?
Look, I mean, my view is that silence would guarantee one outcome, which is nothing happening, and speaking up is the only chance that we have to help Liu Xiaobo and others in these kinds of situations. Look, China didn't have to sign the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it chose to do so. And when a government of its own sovereignty and its own volition signs international treaties, it gives license to the international community to monitor their compliance with those treaties. And so this is exactly what's happened with China. As an American, I have no issue with foreigners, whether it be Mr. Xu or others, that might want to criticize the United States government, for example, for detentions in Guantanamo, or for the use of drone strikes that can cause collateral damage to civilians, or for the massive number of guns we have in the United States, or our serious problems in healthcare. I welcome those kinds of criticisms. I don't find them offensive or improper or inappropriate. And my view is that shining a bright light on what's happening in my country in terms of problems that the United States has is a very, very important way that we improve as a nation. And so I would hope that over time that China, which has of course become much more open to the international community in the last 30 years, will come to understand that criticizing its government's actions is not interfering with its sovereignty. It's trying to uphold the obligations that China has voluntarily taken on as a sovereign nation when it has signed international treaties.
Jared, if I can ask you this, though, and I think the point that...
Can I respond with two points?
Go ahead, Xu. Qinduo.
Yeah, the one I want to point out is that, like Chinese culture is is very different from that of the US or that of the Western countries in general. China's, one of the very important principle of diplomacy for China is non-interference of internal affairs of another country. So China will not take any initiative in criticizing whatever happened in the United States. China does publish a human rights record for the United States only after, which is released only after the U.S. released its human rights report, basically about every country, instead, with the exception of itself. So in general, China, hates to be somehow involved in another country's internal affairs. At the same time, it is very sensitive to, say, criticism, especially the unfair criticism from another country or people from another country. And secondly, in terms of criticism against the Chinese government, if you're familiar with the Chinese social media, Weibo or WeChat, you would see tons of criticism against the Chinese government.
Okay, Jared, quick final word. We have about 30 seconds left.
Look, I mean, I appreciate that Chinese culture is very different than American culture. But what I'm not talking about is culture. What I'm talking about is international law. And when a government signs onto a treaty, you don't have the ability to interpret the treaty differently because you have a different culture. When you sign onto a treaty, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you give license to the treaty monitoring body created by the treaty to monitor your adherence to that treaty and whether or not you're complying with your obligations under international law. At the end of the day, I think China is a great nation. I totally agree with Mr. Xu that it has nothing to fear from individual people like Liu Xiaobo or Liu Xia for that matter. And I think it would show its strength and it would show its, itself to be a great power by allowing her to be free, allowing her to travel abroad as she would like, and similarly not persecuting other dissidents with whom it disagrees.
Okay, Jared, I will have to give you the final word. Very unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. Thank you both so much for joining us.